everybody says PMS. Oh, she's PMSing. Oh, here, the aunt is almost here. How can we help ourselves during those few days?
Yes, Nolan
What do
agrees.
you think, Nolan?
The declining estrogen levels, particularly during perimenopause, will affect your cortisol. And that is basically like a double whammy effect on how easily it is for you to sleep.
Welcome to the Create Today podcast. I'm your host, Karen Stanley, certified rapid transformational therapist and hypnotherapist. And my passion is helping women heal from the past and learn how to create the life they love one day at a time. And this show is all about how you can do just that. My guest today is Renata and Nolan Trebing. She is an intuitive nutrition coach, and she helps women thrive with their cycles and just really feel good during all phases of all stages of life, but also in each stage of your cycle. And she's just amazing at teaching people about their cycles and how there are certain things with nutrition that we can help ourselves feel better and get more energy. And today I'm so excited to have her back. She's already been on my show once. This is round 2, because we're going to talk about how we can help ourselves thrive during perimenopause. So why don't you, just in case for our listeners, well, first of all, hi, Renata, and hi, beautiful Nolan.
Hi, we are so thrilled to be here.
Me too. She said, well, my husband's out of town. I have Nolan. Do you think that would be too distracting? I'm like, well, maybe for me, because who doesn't love a sweet baby? Isn't that funny to have baby fever when you're almost 50 years old? I guess it just never goes away. It's time for my kids to have some kids. Well, no, not yet, but soon. So exciting. So let's talk about, listeners, just to talk about the difference between perimenopause and menopause, because we know that's confusing sometimes.
Yes, it is confusing. And honestly, hopefully this definition will be the most helpful thing you hear to start off the podcast. And when it comes to perimenopause, the thing we want to focus on are the first 4 letters, which is peri, P-E-R-I. So we can liken that to the word perimeter, which also starts with the same 4 letters. So perimeter, meaning basically the around the outside of a particular shape. Perimenopause is something similar. So it's around the time of menopause. It's not full-blown menopause where you've already had 12 months of no bleeding or no period. It's essentially leading up to that time. So this can be anywhere from 4 to 10 years until you reach the official menopause time of your life.
Yeah, that's really helpful, because I have, for the last couple of years, I'm like, well, I'm going to go into menopause at some point. I guess it's any day now. You really don't know, but it's actually not. You're going to be in perimenopause for several years. And so let's start. Where do you start with clients? You have a, client in their 40s that's already in, perimenopause, still has a cycle. Where do you like to start with clients? And every client obviously has specific needs, but what do you find that the most people need help with? Where do you begin?
This is a great question as Nolan grabs the microphone. He has things to say, people.
Nolan, let's hear it.
But the first place that I start with all women is really understanding, what does their cycle look like now? And oftentimes women will not have a good memory about what their cycle looks like. So that means that they might be like, well, I think that sometimes I get a period every 40 days, or I might get a period every 60 days, but they don't have firm information about that. So what we want to do is track your cycle. We want to track, when does your period actually begin? When does your energy levels, mood, fatigue start to worsen? And this can all give us information about when your PMS type symptoms are occurring. So when we know that information, then we can start to alleviate some of those symptoms through the use of nutrition and lifestyle practices. But without having a clear-cut idea of what's happening in your cycle, it can be really challenging. So we really want to track. Now, you can track with lots of different things. You can track with apps. You can track with a journal. You can track with the Notes app on your phone. There's lots of different ways to do it. But the idea here is to track with some way that you can actually stick to. So it literally might be writing down on your paper calendar, my energy is low today, I'm getting some spotting today, or I'm having cravings for chocolate today. And all of those things are really helpful, but we just need as much information as we can.
Excellent advice. I would always say, I always notice the most amount of symptoms just a few days before I started at any given time. And so I started tracking, I don't know, probably 10 years ago. And just because of that, because it just helped me remember, oh yeah, I'm not completely crazy. This is the few days where I struggle the most. And let's talk about, well, I might as well start there. So when you struggle the most a few days before your period starts, um, what's the number one or your top things for what are ways that you can really support yourself during those everybody says PMS. Oh, she's PMSing. Oh, here the aunt is almost here. Whatever, all those sayings. How can we help ourselves during those few days? Those few days are I struggle really. I struggle with frustration. I'm like, wait, why am I so frustrated? Or why am I easily irritated these, few days?
So this is fantastic because what you're describing is exactly what almost 80 to 90% of women experience in the luteal phase, which is the phase before the period begins. And the luteal phase can occur anywhere from 7 to 14 days for some women prior to the onset of the bleed phase or onset of the menstruation phase. So we are all really individual, and that's really the key thing here. Bioindividuality is so important to understand. That's why understanding the nutrition that your body specifically needs is crucial. So whenever your luteal phase occurs, number one, we want to know the duration of that. But number two, we want to know what are your most common PMS symptoms, which is exactly what you're referring to. And so many women experience rage. And I love that you mentioned that because we can also feel like we're not supposed to express rage. But rage is actually a really powerful emotion for us to use as a clue so that we can understand what's going on with our hormones. So all of those PMS symptoms occur because of a hormonal imbalance, meaning that most notably your estrogen and your progesterone levels are rapidly changing, particularly during that luteal phase. So estrogen being one of the main female sex hormones, we know of estrogen because of pregnancy, right? Estrogen is supposed to increase during pregnancy and it helps us to grow the baby. It also has a number of other functions that we might talk about later. But during that luteal phase, estrogen levels are slowly declining. There is a slight secondary bump during that luteal phase where we have a very quick increase and then a decrease of estrogen. And that actually affects our blood sugar regulation. So if you get cravings, which I know a lot of women do, including myself, that can be a really good sign that something's a little amiss with our blood sugar regulation. But also progesterone is the second female sex hormone that is fluctuating a lot during the luteal phase too. And so progesterone, if we break down that word, pro meaning for, gesterone meaning to gestate. So progesterone is for gestation, it's for pregnancy. So if you get pregnant, and this is something that, probably you and I and many other women who have been pregnant before will recognize, a doctor will measure your progesterone levels because they want to make sure your progesterone is continuing to increase during the first roughly 8 to 12 weeks of pregnancy. And that means that we're essentially holding on to the pregnancy. Oftentimes women that experience losses, their progesterone levels are rapidly dropping as opposed to continuing to increase during those first few weeks. So progesterone, really an important hormone, but during the luteal phase, if you're not pregnant, obviously progesterone levels will drop. So it's that changing estrogen and progesterone levels that leads to some PMS symptoms. If, for instance, progesterone drops rapidly, or the difference between your estrogen and progesterone is really, really massive. So what do we do? Well, number one, if you experience things like cramping, headaches, breast tenderness, you might experience things like really heavy flows during the first couple of days of your cycle. This can be an indication that your estrogen levels are too high. And so what I mean by that is you might have high circulating estrogen. So estrogen, once again, that growth hormone, if we have too much estrogen in our bodies, then we can have really heavy bleed phases. A lot of blood is coming out, especially in those first 1 to 3 days. So that gives us information that says, okay, what do I need to do to reduce my estrogen levels? And the way that estrogen gets eliminated from the body is through bowel movements. So one of the things I always ask my clients, especially if they're getting really bad PMS, such as the cramping, such as heavy flows, as well as clotting, is, hey, how is your gut health? Are you having at least 1 to 3 bowel movements a day? And for many, many women, I would say almost 100% of the women I talk to that experience those symptoms, they're not having good bowel movements. Our gut health is so closely tied to our hormonal health. So we really want to
Yes.
make sure that we're eliminating that excess estrogen through bowel movements. So we want to work on increasing fiber, particularly from cruciferous vegetables, because that has the most fiber bang for your buck. So you're going to get way more fiber in cruciferous vegetables, which is fantastic. And it also contains a really great component called DIM, which is short for a chemical name. But DIM helps to detoxify our liver as well, which is really, really, really helpful. So looking at cruciferous vegetables will really be helpful for eliminating the excess estrogen through bowel movements.
And that would be broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage. What else?
Brussels sprouts, bok choy, arugula, asparagus. They're all really, really great options. And at different times of the year, you might find that they're on sale as well. So that can be helpful too, especially if you're trying to eat within a budget.
That's really interesting. We need to reduce the estrogen levels if we're having these other symptoms. So the irritability, where does that come from? And how do you help yourself with that specific? Is that advice, which is excellent? Does it apply to every single symptom? Is it the same thing? Is it the same strategy for all of those? Or are there different things that you can do for different symptoms?
So I'm so glad that you brought this back to the other symptoms, because no, that doesn't apply to every single symptom.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. And especially if you're feeling, for instance, anxiety increasing, or you're feeling the rage or feeling the frustration, heat during that luteal phase, one of the things I always look at are your progesterone levels. So progesterone, we talked about it as being that hormone for pregnancy. And the other thing to remember is that progesterone is an anti-anxiety hormone amongst its many other functions. So if you're noticing that your anxiety increases in your luteal phase, the thing to remember is that might be an indication your progesterone levels are dropping too low in comparison to your estrogen levels. So you can see it's a very delicate balance between having too high estrogen or too low progesterone. And so we really want to consider progesterone when it comes to our food. So with progesterone, what we want to remember, especially during that luteal phase, is our body needs energy. So you might have experienced, as I have, during that luteal phase, oh my gosh, my hunger gets so much higher, right?
Yes.
So it's been
starving. I want to eat 24/7.
Right. And so part of that is because our estrogen levels are dropping. When we have higher estrogen, it actually stops our appetite from increasing. But also with progesterone, especially if we're suffering with low progesterone symptoms, we want to make sure we're eating sufficient complex carbohydrates, because that tells our bodies we have the energy to produce more of this hormone. So by complex carbohydrates, we're talking about things like sweet potato, brown rice, quinoa, oats, that kind of thing.
Okay. And then for other types of symptoms besides those two, we also fatigue. That's a big one. I guess that's kind of the same answer. You need more energy. You're going to need more complex carbohydrates. Is that right? You need to increase the progesterone.
Yes, Nolan agrees.
What do you think, Nolan?
So the other thing to remember, especially because hormones are so sensitive to stress, is any form of increased stress during your cycle. And I'm talking about all the way through the entire month, not just during the menstruation phase, can impact your hormonal balance. The reason why that's important is because stress, i.e. cortisol, the stress hormone, is produced from the adrenal glands, which sit on top of the kidneys. Now, if for some reason your body needs to produce even more cortisol during that particular month, it can affect things like your blood sugar regulation. So the more stress that we have, the less stable our blood sugar levels are. So we actually dial down our insulin sensitivity, meaning that we need to produce more insulin to have the same effect on our blood sugar levels as, during a time when we don't have that much stress. We also notice that when we produce more cortisol, it actually drains our vitamin B from our bodies. So vitamin B is a crucial vitamin that we need to get from things like animal proteins, as well as nutritional yeast, which is one of the things that I love and I recommend for people who are vegetarian or vegan, because we need vitamin B, all the different kinds of vitamin B, in order to make sure our bodies have the key nutrients and energy to produce hormones at the levels that we need.
Wonderful. Now, do you recommend getting your blood work actually, or your blood drawn during your luteal phase so you can see what the actual levels are? Or do you, because every time I get my blood drawn, they tell me a different, make sure it's in the middle of your cycle, or, at the beginning of your cycle, or whatever. They usually have a period of time where they recommend doing it. Would it be helpful to see exactly what it is, 3 days before your period starts? Or do we just go by symptoms?
So with blood testing, it is really interesting because there's always a different reason for getting your blood tested. And many times you'll have a doctor that will just want to take one blood test during one specific time frame of your cycle, usually the early luteal phase. This can be helpful, but it doesn't give us the whole picture. And that's the one thing I want all women to remember. When it comes to lab work, especially around our hormones, we have to remember one snapshot in time is not going to give us the full picture. It's like when you go on vacation, you just take the one picture of the landscape, but it doesn't give you that full picture of everything you did during your vacation.
So
That's
true.
essentially what we want to do. So lab testing is a really interesting space that I think all women need to be a little bit more knowledgeable about. So with lab testing, there's always a different reason for doing lab testing. But if you really want to get a full sense of your entire cycle, we probably want to look at getting lab testing throughout the entire cycle instead of just getting a snapshot in time, which is typically what many doctors will do. They'll just say early in the luteal phase, day 19, day 20, we want to know when that is, and then we'll do a lab test to look at your hormones on that one particular day. The difficulty with that is that some women haven't yet seen the drop in their, for instance, estrogen or progesterone levels. And so that's oftentimes when women see the results come back that say, oh, everything's within the normal ranges. But this also brings up the conversation around what is a normal range. So your normal range may be different from my normal range and vice versa. So we really want to get clear on what's happening throughout the entire cycle, which means possibly multiple lab tests, as well as determining what's your normal. What are the things that when your hormone levels drop by 1%, that's what's actually giving you the biggest change to your PMS symptoms, or leading to perimenopausal symptoms too.
That's a really good point. And you would determine what our own normal would be by how you feel.
100%. So a
And
lot
what
of it
else?
is symptoms. How do you feel during different phases of your cycle? What are the things that affect you the most? Because there are some women who are very sensitive to stress. And so that might be the one thing that really impacts their hormonal balance the most. Whereas for other women, it might be something else, such as I didn't get a lot of sleep this month. And obviously sleep has a huge impact on our health. Or it could be things like my diet 100% changed because I was traveling a lot. So if your diet changes, it could be affecting your gut health, which, as we've just discussed, also impacts your hormonal health too.
Wow, that's really good. I want to break down those three because I don't think people talk about not enough. How less sleep or not adequate sleep affects your hormones. Can you just talk about sleep for a second? How does that affect the hormones, and why does it cause our symptoms to be worse?
I'm so glad you mentioned this because this is a link that I think not a lot of people understand too. So, when we don't get adequate sleep, it's important to remember that sleep helps with a variety of functions in the body. So, number one, it actually helps with reducing stress hormone cortisol. If we're not getting adequate sleep, that cortisol level actually remains pretty high, or it can lead to dysregulated cortisol patterns throughout the day. And so, what I mean by that is normally what you should feel is your cortisol levels rise at the very beginning of the day, usually in line with sunrise, so that you wake up. And that would be normal. Throughout the rest of the day, your cortisol levels should slowly decline, leading to feeling a little bit sleepier and then sleepier until you get ready to go to bed at night. A dysregulated cortisol pattern might mean your spike at the beginning of the day happens at 2 or 3 a.m. And then you might find it really hard to go back to sleep or stay asleep if you do fall asleep again. And then you might get really tired at 3 p.m. or not get tired till 1 a.m. And then this whole cycle exacerbates because your cortisol pattern is totally dysregulated. So sleep is critical to cortisol. Now, cortisol also ties in with estrogen. So there are links between high cortisol and high estrogen, just like we talked about before. So if you're experiencing high stress, it might mean you get a lot of belly fat accumulating, particularly around the lower abdomen, which is an area that a lot of women have issue with. Or you might also notice things like your hunger levels increasing. So stress, lovely stress, affects another hormone called ghrelin, which essentially is our hunger hormone. It's like, how hungry are you? So ghrelin can increase by up to 30% if you have just one night of not having good sleep.
Wow.
Yeah. And it also increases what you crave. So you're going to be craving more refined carbohydrates, more high sugar foods, because your body is recognizing, okay, I'm in a state of stress. I need energy. How am I going to get energy as quickly as possible? And usually it's from those highly refined foods because it impacts your blood sugar levels faster.
Wow. So that's why we crave them in the first place.
Yes.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Okay. Then I had a lot of people ask me about those nighttime wake up sessions that are such a nightmare because all you want is to sleep. And when your cortisol, so that's from cortisol spiking at 2 o'clock in the morning. What causes that?
So interestingly, just like we talked about, the declining estrogen levels, particularly during perimenopause, will affect your cortisol. And that is basically like a double whammy effect on how easily it is for you to sleep. So perimenopause, because it's such a time of fluctuation, you might have times where you sleep amazingly and you might have times where you can barely sleep at all. Right. And so it's because of the up and down motion of estrogen, which is also affecting your cortisol levels. And then, of course, if you're stressing out about not being able to sleep, it just exacerbates it even more. So you can see how these things compound over time. So looking at your estrogen levels is really one of the first things to do, especially during perimenopause, as well as thinking about some other foods or supplements that you might want to consider taking, such as magnesium, which helps to relax all of those muscles in the body. I know a lot of women, especially my clients, that will take some magnesium before bedtime, and that helps them drift off to sleep. So that can be something to also consider. Or if we want to target cortisol, we might think of adrenal herbs like ashwagandha, which helps to lower that cortisol level as well. Helps to give your body a little bit of a wind down routine as well. If you create something that helps you to detach from the earlier part of the day, release some of those stresses, and then ease into sleep and hopefully help you to stay asleep as well.
That's incredible. I have found I bought into the whole a glass or two of red wine is healthy for you. You know, all those studies that say that, and now most people say that is absolutely not true. And I have found if I do have a glass or two of wine, I will 100% of the time wake up in the middle of the night. It's mind blowing. And because I always thought, oh, it's relaxing. You get the resveratrol. It's got what do they say? I can't remember what they say was good about the red wine. Not at all. It's just total sugar. It totally wrecks my body. When I was younger, it didn't really matter. It had no trouble with this. But as we get older and we change, um, will you speak to the red wine or how alcohol, affects your hormones and it affects my sleep big time? And is that because it's raising a certain hormone? Is it raising cortisol after you drink red wine?
So red wine or really any alcohol is interesting because I think a lot of people do experience what you said, which is it feels relaxing. It feels like I can go to sleep now because it's kind of my
Mm-hmm.
trigger for this is the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting is even though alcohol might help you to initially fall asleep, more studies have shown that alcohol consumption doesn't allow you to stay asleep because of
Yeah.
things like blood sugar level spikes. Or it might be doing things, in the long run. And this might be something that you've experienced too in terms of affecting your gut health. So we know that especially with binge drinking, it can kill up to 50% of the good gut bacteria. And so if you spend so long eating well during the week and then you have one night of binge drinking, oh my gosh, the impact of that is considerable. And you probably know this, but you don't sleep well also. I mean, obviously, if your gut microbiome is affected, it's going to affect your immune system. So you might wake up the next day feeling a little sniffly or feeling a little under the weather too. There's so many things that alcohol can affect. And by no means am I saying that that affects everybody, but for those of us that it does have an impact on, for me, it definitely affected my gut health, which is why I opted not to drink for years now.
Mm,
But yeah, alcohol does have a huge impact on our gut health. And once again, gut health is so closely tied into hormonal health.
totally. Yeah, that's interesting because you said specifically binge drinking, but there's so many other studies out that are saying that it doesn't even need to be a big amount. It can,
Yeah,
I mean, Dr. Amen says that. He's
yeah.
always talking about how the alcohol affects the brain, even with one glass. And I found that to be astonishing. Like I couldn't believe it at first with all of this stuff about all of how good a little bit of red wine is fine and a little bit of red wine is good for your heart and a little bit of red wine. It's like there's so much stuff out there that completely contradicts what you're saying and what really happens when you drink or just have sugar. I mean, I think it's the same as eating sugar. And my sister went to a naturopath yesterday that said soda is exactly the same thing. Soda does exactly the same thing in your body that alcohol does.
Yeah, I was just about to say that because
Mm.
once again, if we come back to bio individuality, there might be some people that might say, what, I don't get that effect from red wine, but I maybe get that effect from when I have G&T, some gin and tonics. You might have some
Yes.
people that when they just drink a full sugar soda, they're like, oh my gosh, I feel jittery. I feel like I can't sleep well. I'm sweating a lot. There's lots of different reasons why different people experience different things. And that's the key to using nutrition as a means of healing the body. It's about getting to know yourself and what works for your body and your hormones.
I'm so glad you mentioned that again, because that is so important. And then that comes back to the very first thing you said about why it's so important to track, not just to see the days and if you're 28 or if you're 40, that's less important. It is important, but it's less important than how each of the days, how you actually feel specifically. And so you know what's going on. And so then you can not attack, then you can help and supplement and do the things that specifically work for you because everybody's different.
Yes, everyone is different. And this is the key thing. And it's so important to remember this, especially when it comes to hormone balance, because all of our hormones react differently to different foods, to different life stressors, to different environmental stressors. So we do want to keep that in mind. And we do want to take guidance from people that we see on social media, etc., with a grain of salt before thinking like there's only one magic bullet, right? There's only one silver bullet for everything. It's so key that we understand our own cycles, our own hormones, because there's so much wisdom and knowledge in that. When you understand it, when you look at what your PMS symptoms are, those are your clues. It's telling us clues all the time about what your body needs. And even things like cravings are telling us information about what your body is actually needing that could also potentially help to minimize or eliminate your PMS symptoms.
It's brilliant. Okay, let's go back to stress. Now, stress, when we feel stressed, that will make our body produce more cortisol, and that will also affect the sleep. So we want to go back to those things that affect us the most that we don't necessarily think about, or we don't really um, analyze those two things. From my perspective, I feel like most of us are in fight or flight most of the time, just living in the modern world that we live in with access to information in our pocket 24/7. We have very full schedules, and we just get used to it. I really think that I was probably in fight or flight for 49 years. I'm 49. It, and so that's why I love what I'm doing is to help regulate your nervous systems, and so that you can get back to a baseline of more calm, and that affects you physically, as we know. And so I want you to talk about stress and how can you help ease stressful situations with nutrition and tracking your cycle and tracking your symptoms. What do you find that helps your clients the most?
Okay, I love this because I completely agree with you. I honestly think it's an epidemic that many of us women are experiencing, where not only are we caregivers for our children or perhaps the children of others as well, helping each other out is key when it comes to motherhood, but also we're juggling things like cooking good meals, we're trying to work, we're trying to look after elderly parents, we're trying to do a million things every single day. And that amount of stress might seem like, oh, it's not that bad. Look at this other person who's experiencing, so much more stress than I am. Any form of stress on your life is going to affect your health.
100%.
Now, there are some forms of stress that might be positive. So, for instance, when you go to the gym and you do some resistance training, that's actually a helpful form of stress that's building muscle. Muscle can be so helpful for things like metabolism, for helping with blood sugar regulation as well. But what we don't often recognize, and this is true of myself as well, is that the amount of things that we just gradually add to our plates, our proverbial plates, over and over
Mhm.
again, that will get to a breaking point. And like you mentioned, you're in fight or flight for so long that you don't even realize you're in it. And so this is really the first step for many clients. They'll come to me and they'll say, I feel like my PMS has gotten so much worse. And I'll ask them about their lives, and they're caregivers and they're full-time workers, or they're running their own businesses, or they're doing a million things and they don't even realize they're stressed out beyond belief. And not only that, they're not getting good sleep. They're not eating well because they're so stressed out. They don't have time to cook or to grab, a healthy meal. All of these things compound upon each other. And so the first step is always to recognize, what are the things that are causing me stress in my life? And they can be different. My life is different from your life, is different from everyone else's. And so
It's the kids. We got to get rid of the kids.
yeah. So it's,
No, but I
yeah.
really just want to reiterate that because my clients sometimes have a hard time even articulating the emotions and the feelings that they have because they're
Mhm.
just so used to them. They don't even have a label anymore. They wouldn't even consider themselves stressed. I just want to reiterate
Exactly.
that because I hear that in my practice every day. And that is so important to just have the awareness.
Mhm.
And how do you help your clients get that awareness of, or do you help them just take a look at all of the things that are on their plate? Or how do you help
Yes.
them create that awareness first?
Yeah. So really it can be a big eye opener for them, because sometimes we think that stress is like you see in a holiday movie, where stress is like you're running around with like 50 shopping bags and you still got to get the kids from school, and it's like this big to do. That's
Mm,
oftentimes what we think stress is. But stress can
yes.
also be the little kid pulling at your pant leg for 20 hours of a 24-hour day. It can also be the, hey, honey, can you also do this other thing for me, while you're already filled to the brim with like changing diapers, trying to answer emails, trying to get on Zoom calls. You might not even recognize what are the things that are causing you stress, and they could be little. And it gets especially worse when you have so many of these little things on your plate on a day-to-day basis. So we got to really think about things from, what does stress look like for me? How do I recognize the feeling of stress? Because it might not be the emotional outburst. It might
Mm-mm.
be the withdrawing. It might be the, I just want to hide from the world. It might be the, I at night go to the pantry and eat a full bag of chips because that's my way of coping.
Mhm.
There's lots of different things that we need to first ascertain around, how do you cope with the stress that you might not even recognize as stress. Let's shine a light on that without judgment. And then the second thing I do is I talk about the hormone hierarchy. And so, just like any kind of hierarchy, it is the order in which hormones affect all the other hormones in the body. And this is something that's not taught in schools. It's not anything that is typically taught to women, but we need to understand it, because the sex hormones that we talked about are just kind of the bottom of the ladder, the bottom of the hierarchy. We
Right.
want to get to the top of the ladder and look at what are the most critical hormones there. The second to top hormone is cortisol. So out of all the other 65 plus hormones in the body, if your cortisol levels are through the roof, that is absolutely going to affect all those other hormones, those 63 plus hormones below them. So we want to really get to the cause of your cortisol, affect that positively, and then go above that in the hormone hierarchy, because that's the most positive, powerful hormone, and that's oxytocin. When you know how to boost your oxytocin in your life, that's going to have a huge positive ripple effect on every other hormone and the health in your body as well.
Love it. Okay, what are the best ways to reduce cortisol levels?
So there's two ways to reduce your cortisol. The first way that we'll talk about is through lifestyle practices, as so many of us know. And the thing to remember is sometimes your lifestyle practice might not actually be as effective anymore. So you do want to look at, okay, maybe I've been doing meditation for every day for a year and I'm noticing it's not that impactful. It might be time to change it up. It might be time to do something different, like journaling or lifting a few heavier weights or talking to a friend, getting a therapist, something like that.
Yes.
So the other ways that we can reduce cortisol levels is we also want to think about stress from the perspective of, what are we putting into our body?
Yeah.
Because if we're putting a lot of refined product into our body, it actually makes cortisol production increase. So we want to think about putting foods into our bodies that nourish our bodies, that help to reduce all forms of stress. When it comes to nourishing your body to help with cortisol, we want to think about things like omega-3 rich foods, which are those anti-inflammatory fatty acids. With any form of stress, it does cause inflammation to the gut lining, but also to our cells. Omega-3 rich foods could be things like
Salmon.
salmon, yeah,
What
or
else? Eggs, the
eggs,
yolks.
egg yolks, wild caught fatty fish of any kind. So it could be
Mhm.
salmon, it could be tuna, mackerel, sardines. You can also
Mm.
think about supplements. You can think about chia seeds and flax seeds. They're all great sources of omega-3s. And omega-3s are things that our bodies don't produce. So we want to make sure that we're getting it through food or through supplements.
Mm. I love it. Well, thank you so much. How can people find you and work with you to help with just easing these symptoms and sleep better and have more energy? How can they find you?
Well, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it. And Nolan does too.
Nolan is ready to wrap this up, and that's okay. I mean, I'd prefer to talk a little bit longer, but Nolan has spoken, and
Nolan has spoken.
we're all just in Nolan's world, really.
Yeah, we just obey whatever Nolan says. But people can get in touch with me. So on my website, nourishwithrenata.com, there's a 20-minute free consultation form on there, which is a fantastic way of getting started. Or you can also connect with me on Instagram. My handle is at nourish_with_Renata. And that's a great way to keep up to date with daily hormone balancing tips.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And I'm going to upload the transcription of this episode as well onto my website. It'll be on as a quote blog post, because what she said, if you don't have time to take notes, is just really, really good stuff in there. So you can go to my website, Create Today Therapy as well. Renata, thank you so much. Nolan, thank you for letting us borrow your mama for an hour. I really appreciate it so much. This has been so helpful.
Oh, so welcome. Thank you. And Nolan sends his regards.
after he eats and takes a nap.
Right.
Awesome. Thanks, Renata.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here and listening to my show. If you got any value at all, it would mean the world if you shared it and left a review. Remember, the only way to create the life you love is to take it one day at a time. Create today. God bless you.